Imagine a queen, wrapped in gold, worshipped as a goddess, immortalized in marble. Her name whispered with reverence across temples and palaces. But beneath the jewels, behind the crown, was a girl who was raped by her own father and forced into marriage with her brother. A girl whose story was buried under centuries of royal propaganda, myth, and silence. Her name was Arsinoe, II, of Egypt, and her story is one of the darkest, most disturbing legacies of the ancient world, on a world where incest wasn't just accepted, but celebrated, where power flowed through bloodlines like poison. Arsinoe was trapped in a royal nightmare dressed up as divine destiny. She was born into the ruling family of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a dynasty that claimed to be gods on earth, descendants of Alexander the Great's legacy. But behind the marble statues and gilded walls was something else. A royal family obsessed with blood purity, a court where brothers married sisters, fathers ruled daughters with unchecked control, and women, even queens, were nothing more than pawns in a game played by cruel and powerful men. And for Arsinoe, the game was brutal. We know her as a queen, a strategist, a political genius. But what if her rise to power was built on a foundation of unthinkable abuse? What if the very temples that praised her also served to erase the screams that echoed behind palace doors? This is not your typical history lesson. This is the untold story of a queen who lived in silence, whose suffering was rewritten as glory, and whose trauma was polished into mythology. This is the story of Arsinoe II, the queen who was raped by her father and forced to marry her brother. And today, we're going to strip away the gold and finally tell the truth. Before she was a queen, before the scandals, the politics, the trauma, Arsinoe II was a child, a daughter of a gentle king, born into a world where power wasn't inherited gently. It was taken by force, sealed with blood, and defended by manipulation. She was born around 316 BCE in the royal palace of Egypt, just after the death of Alexander the Great. Her father, Ptolemy Isoter, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, who carved out his own empire in Egypt and crowned himself pharaoh. Her mother, Bernice, a strong and politically sharp woman in her own right. From the moment of her birth, Arsinoe was marked for power, but also for sacrifice. She grew up in the royal court of Alexandria, surrounded by scholars, soldiers, priests, and enemies. The Ptolemaic court was no ordinary palace. It was a place of whispers, poisoned wine, secret affairs, and most dangerously of all, a place where family meant nothing if you stood in the way of the throne. From a young age, Arsinoe would have been trained in the arts of rule, politics, religion, manipulation, and image. She learned how to speak to crowds, how to sit with power, how to hide emotions behind silence. Because in a royal family where siblings married each other, and fathers controlled the destinies of daughters, survival meant obedience. And if you were a daughter, you were currency, a tool to secure alliances, or to be kept close as a symbol of power and fertility. But Arsinoe was not just a pawn. Even early on, she showed signs of something else: ambition, strategy, defiance. Unlike many royal women of her time, Arsinoe wouldn't be satisfied with a quiet life in the shadows. She wouldn't just accept her role as wife or mother. She would fight for more, for power, for recognition, for survival, and this made her dangerous, not just to outsiders, but to her own family. It's no coincidence that Arsinoe's story is so controversial, because the deeper you go, the more the history starts to blur with horror. The records grow silent, the praises grow louder, but the truth screams between the lines. Who was Arsinoe II? A queen, a sister, a survivor, a victim? The answer is all of them. To understand Arsinoe's fate, we must first understand the world she was born into. A world shaped not by peace, but by conquest. By one man's ambition to rule the known world, Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, he left behind a broken empire and no clear heir. His generals, the Diadochi, turned on one another, carving up the empire like vultures around a carcass. One of those generals was Ptolemy I, Arsinoe's father. Ptolemy was clever. Instead of claiming the chaos of Greece or the vast lands of Persia, he seized Egypt, the jewel of the ancient world, a land rich in gold, grain, and gods, where pharaohs were seen as living deities. And that's exactly what he became, declared himself pharaoh, not just king. He fused Greek military power with Egyptian divine authority, and laid the foundation for a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years. This was the Ptolemaic dynasty, part Greek, part Egyptian, fully obsessed with control. But that control came with a price. To keep power in the family, they did something that shocked even their Greek contemporaries. They married their own sisters. They slept with their own daughters. They raised incest from taboo. The royal policy, the Ptolemies believed that divinity ran through bloodlines, and to dilute that blood with outsiders was a threat to their godlike image. So they turned to each other, brother to sister, father to daughter, queen to sibling. These weren't isolated cases. This was systematic. In public, they were gods. In private, they were prisoners of a belief system that fed on control. paranoia, and blood ties. For Archino, this meant she was never truly free. Every step she took in that palace, every look from her father, every whisper in the corridor came with an unspoken rule. Your body belongs to the dynasty. The dynasty had been born through war, conquest, and incest, and for the next generation to survive, someone had to pay the price. She was born into silk sheets and marble halls, into the house of a man the world called a god. But little Arsino was just a child. Her father, Ptolemy I, ruled Egypt not just as a king, but as a pharaoh, a divine figure in the eyes of the people. And as his daughter, Arsino was both a symbol and a tool, a living piece of political strategy. From the moment she could walk, Arsino was trained in 2 languages, Greek and Egyptian. She learned the art of court speech, divine rituals, the histories of gods and kings. But she also learned something else, something darker, that her body wasn't hers, that her future was written by men who sat in the throne room, sipping wine and plotting lineage. That love wasn't part of her destiny, but obedience was. In the Ptolemaic court, children weren't raised with affection. They were shaped, groomed, molded into instruments of power. And for a royal daughter, the endgame was always the same: marriage, not to a stranger, but often to blood. As Arsinoe grew, so did the whispers. Whispers about her beauty, her charm, her usefulness. The court began to look at her not as a person, but as a pathway to maintain blood purity, to protect dynastic power, and looming over her was her father, Ptolemy. I had already made history by declaring Egypt Greek. But he was about to make a new kind of history by declaring his daughter something more than just royal. There were rumors, silent, hidden, deadly. Rumors that Ptolemy, like many in his bloodline, had begun to see his daughter not as a child, but as a vessel, a symbol of sacred blood, meant to be possessed, not protected. And Arsinoe, she had no voice, no choice, no escape. She was caught between myth and monstrosity, between the legacy of a kingdom and the nightmare of its demands. Before she was a queen, Arsinoe was a daughter, but in the house of Ptolemy, even that title came with a price. You see, to modern ears, it sounds like monstrosity, a father marrying his daughter, a brother lying with his sister. But in the house of the Ptolemies, this wasn't madness. It was policy. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great, ruled Egypt, with a Greek heart and an Egyptian mask. And what was the one thing both cultures agreed upon? That royal blood was sacred, not to be shared, not to be diluted, not to be touched by common hands. So instead of marrying foreign princesses, they married their sisters, their daughters, their own blood. It wasn't about love. It was about control, about power that stayed in the family. No outsiders, no divided loyalties. But here's the darker side. These marriages were never equal. These were arranged, forced, and often violating. Consent didn't exist when the king declared himself divine. For the Ptolemies, incest was not a taboo. It was a tool, as sharp and calculated as a blade. And it had one terrifying message: no one outside this family is worthy. Arsinoe, too, like many royal daughters before her, wasn't asked. She was given, offered, positioned. And when the decision came, when the court announced that she would marry a blood relative, possibly even her own father, there was no protest. Because in this dynasty, silence was obedience, and obedience was survival. But let's not forget something important. This wasn't just Egypt. The Ptolemies made incest into a political strategy that terrified and shocked even other kingdoms. While Rome and Athens whispered disgust, Egypt crowned it. So the question is not why they did it, but what it did to the children, the queens, the young girls like Arsinoe, who were pulled into a twisted game where love and violence looked the same. Arsinoe wasn't just married off. She was sealed inside a dynasty obsessed with itself. Her womb, her mind, her choices, all became state property. And in the name of keeping blood pure, the Ptolemies created something far more corrupted than any outside threat could ever be. Behind the marble and gold, the incest throne demanded its price. And for Arsinoe, that price was everything. The torches were lit. The palace was silent. And in the grand temple hall, gilded in gold, guarded by gods carved in stone, a young girl stood, dressed like a queen, but trembling like a prisoner. This was not a wedding as we know it. There was no joy, no celebration, no shared future of dreams. It was a ritual, designed to look divine, but hiding the weight of something darker. The Egyptians called it sacred union. The Greeks whispered incestus. But within the palace, no one dared name it. Arsinoe, too, daughter of Pharaoh, child of royal blood, was dressed to honor the goddess Isis, the divine mother's sister wife, and who stood beside her, not a foreign prince, not a noble general, a family member. Possibly her own father. Ptolemaic tradition blurred the lines between gods and rulers, between family and spouse. They modeled their unions on divine mythology, where Isis married her brother Osiris. But this wasn't mythology. This was flesh and blood, and Arsinoe was only a girl. The ceremony was cloaked in pomp, music, priestly chants, offerings to the gods. But beneath the incense and gold, it was something else. a royal branding, one that told her, you don't belong to yourself anymore. Every motion was scripted, every gesture rehearsed. Her silence was the final ritual. There are no surviving records that describe how Arsinoe felt, no diary, no rebellion, no refusal. But sometimes, history's silence screams louder than any document. In her eyes, in her stillness, we find the echo of every girl who was told, this is your duty. Your body belongs to the crown. Imagine standing there, knowing that tonight, your life ends and a role begins. But everything you were, is now gone. The ceremony had no name, but for Arsinoe, it was the moment her freedom died. The ceremony was over. The gold circlet placed on her head. The people had been told, rejoice, the gods are pleased. But Arsinoe, too, she knew what it truly was. Not a coronation, a sentence. From this day forward, she would be known not just as a queen, but as a wife to her own blood. Not by choice, but by command. But Ptolemies justified their incestuous marriages by claiming divine example. Isis married her brother. Therefore, so should the queens of Egypt. But this wasn't love. It wasn't sacred. It was politics dipped in perfume and violence. Dressed in silk. There are whispers in the scrolls of Greek historians that the union was between Arsinoe and her father, Ptolemy. Others say it was a half-brother or a much older uncle. But here's what they all agree on. She was given no choice. Why? Because Arsinoe's womb was the key to dynastic power. If she could produce a royal heir, one born of pure blood, untainted lineage, that child would be hailed as a living god. Half human, half divine, and the people would bow, not knowing the horror behind that child's conception. That's what made this marriage sacred and monstrous. It wasn't just about power. It was about keeping that power in the family, even if it broke the women who carried it. Arsinoe bled, not just in body, but in identity. Her past erased, her future decided. She would now share a bed with a man who had once carried her in his arms as a child. She would be praised for her fertility, not her mind. And every time she smiled in public, it was a mask. We often talk of royal marriages as alliances, but for Arsinoe it was a prison, one with velvet walls and gold locks. She wasn't loved. She was used. A jewel in the family crown, a vessel for continuity, a sacrifice dressed as a goddess. And when the bloodlines blurred, when the gods were invoked to mask human crimes, Arsinoe's name became royal, but her soul was never hers again. She wore the crown. She signed decrees. The people bowed when she passed. But Arsinoe too knew the truth. In the grand game of royal power, she wasn't a player. She was a pawn, beautiful, strategic, and disposable. After being married to her father, or possibly half-brother, she would go on to marry again. This time, another brother, Ptolemy Keranos, the very man who would later murder her children. Yes, you heard that right. The second husband of Arsinoe killed her sons from the first marriage to secure his own claim to the throne. And what did Arsinoe do? She survived. She fled. She sailed across the sea to Egypt, alone, childless, a queen without a court, but not broken. In Egypt, she made a bold, dangerous decision to marry again. This time to her full brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and from this moment, Arsinoe became something else. Not just a pawn. She became a ruler. Her face was stamped on coins alongside her brothers, an unprecedented honor. She was called Thea Philadelphus, the sibling-loving goddess. The propaganda was clear. This marriage is divine. This union is sacred. She is untouchable. But history, as always, has two sides. One side paints Arsinoe as the perfect Ptolemaic queen, wise, diplomatic, adored by the people. The other whispers a darker truth, that behind the coins and temples, behind the titles and honors, was a woman who had learned to play the only game available to her, the game of survival. You see, Arsinoe could have been crushed. After abuse, after loss, after betrayal, but instead, she steered the ship. She advised her brother husband on foreign policy. She helped stabilize Egypt's economy. She reshaped the image of what a queen could be. And in doing so, she wrote herself into history. Not just as a victim, but as a force. Arsinoe too may have been born into trauma, but she chose power. She may have been forced to marry, but she forced the world to remember her name. Power fades, statues crack, empires crumble, but gods live forever. Arsinoe, too, had been abused, betrayed, used as a political pawn, and yet, she made the ultimate transformation. She became a goddess in the temples of Egypt. Her image stood beside that of Isis and Hathor. Her name was etched in stone. Her likeness, crowned and veiled, was carried in state-sponsored rituals, and her cult wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated by the state. How did a woman, violated and discarded by power, rise to such sacred status? The answer is chillingly brilliant: myth-making. The Ptolemies knew what they were doing. They used divinity to justify the unthinkable. Incest, it's divine. Sibling marriage, it's modeled after the gods. A queen with a blood-soaked past. She's sacred, above blame. And Arsinoe leaned into it. She didn't reject the narrative, she harnessed it. Her temples rose in cities across Egypt and Greece. Coins bore her face for decades, and sailors would pray to her for protection at sea, not just as a queen, but as a guardian spirit. One historian wrote that her worship blended grief with glory, because beneath the marble, beneath the chants, beneath the divine mask, was still a woman who turned pain into policy, suffering into sanctity, trauma into transcendence. Arsinoe, it didn't just rewrite her story. She made the world rewrite theirs. To remember her, not as a victim, not even just a queen, but as a goddess who ruled through storms and emerged divine. Every family has secrets, but some secrets are written in blood. In most cultures, incest was taboo, a sin, a scandal, a sickness, but not for the Ptolemies. In their world, it was a strategy. The Ptolemies didn't just accept incest, they built a dynasty around it. Brother married sister, uncle took niece, father eyed daughter. Why? Because marrying within the bloodline meant power stayed concentrated, no foreign prince could steal the throne, no rival family could claim legitimacy. And more importantly, it was a page torn straight from Egyptian mythology. Isis married her brother Osiris. They ruled together as divine twins. The Ptolemies weren't just copying gods, they were claiming to be them. And Arsinoe, she played her part flawlessly. After marrying her full brother, yes, the same one her father tried to control, she was proclaimed the sister wife of the living god. This wasn't just politics, this was propaganda. The incest wasn't hidden, it was celebrated, even immortalized in coinage, statues, and festivals. But beneath the divine titles was a deeply human cost. Incest led to genetic vulnerabilities, children born with deformities, heirs who didn't survive childhood, and paranoia that infected the entire royal court. Brothers poisoned brothers, sisters plotted against nephews. Entire branches of the family were wiped out, not by war, but by betrayal. Arsinoe's story can't be separated from this dark tradition. Her life was twisted by a family structure that demanded incest as proof of loyalty. She was both a victim and a pillar of this system. And in the end, the very thing that gave the Ptolemies their divine image is what destroyed them. A dynasty built on secrets, bound by blood, haunted by the price of keeping power too close to home. Imagine living a nightmare and being told to smile through it. Imagine being a victim and the world hailing your suffering as divine. That was Arsinoe's reality. On the surface, Arsinoe was a goddess, a queen, a figure to be adored. Coins bore her image. Temples were dedicated in her name. Historians called her wise, powerful, radiant. But what if all of that was a carefully constructed lie? Let's look closer. Ancient Egypt and the Ptolemies were masters of propaganda. And in a world without Twitter, newspapers, or free speech, the only version of the truth that survived was the one the palace allowed. Official inscriptions described Arsinoe's marriage to her brother Ptolemy II as a holy union, inspired by the gods. She was crowned the sister wife, a title meant to echo the myth of Isis and Osiris. In temples, they were shown side by side, equals in divinity. But what these carvings didn't show was the pain behind the pose. These so-called divine marriages often began in abuse. Power wasn't shared equally, it was forced. The younger spouse, often a girl, had no say. But once married, she was immortalized in stone, with no mention of consent. Even ancient writers who hinted at scandal had to be careful. Describing a queen's rape as a sacred union was safer than accusing a king of a crime. And so, over time, the truth was polished. The horror was dressed in gold. The girl who may have cried in the night was remembered as a goddess. This is how empires lie. Not just with words, but with ritual, with art, and with silence. The abuse wasn't hidden, it was rebranded. The saddest part, the victims had to play along. Arsinoe wore the crown. She attended the ceremonies. She kissed the same man who once may have violated her freedom, not because she loved him, but because her survival depended on it. In the story of Arsinoe, royal propaganda didn't just rewrite the truth, it buried it alive. Here's a question history rarely wants us to ask. Was Arsinoe just a pawn in a twisted royal game? Or did she learn to play the game better than anyone else? After the forced marriage, after the abuse, after the humiliation, Arsinoe could have disappeared into the background like so many royal women before her, but she didn't. In fact, Arsinoe became one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history. She wasn't just a queen, she became coroller with her brother husband Ptolemy II. Her name appeared on decrees, her image on coins, her voice echoed in temples. So, what happened? How did a girl who may have been raped and married off for politics rise to share a throne and shape an empire? The answer lies in one word: intelligence. Arsinoe was no fool. She studied power like a strategist. She used religion, language, and marriage as tools, and sometimes, weapons. She made alliances, possibly led military initiatives, and helped stabilize her brother's rule. In fact, when Ptolemy launched the first Egyptian navy, many believe Arsinoe helped design the strategy. But here's the uncomfortable twist. Survival in the ancient world often required submission, and submission didn't mean surrender, it meant adaptation. Did she embrace her role as queen out of loyalty, or out of sheer will to survive and outmaneuver? Some historians argue that Arsinoe used the very institution that imprisoned her to build her own empire of influence. Her divine marriage wasn't just compliance, it became a platform. She turned her forced union into a stage of power. Perhaps Arsinoe understood something deeply tragic and deeply human. If you can't escape the cage, rule from inside it. She transformed her trauma into strategy, her silence into symbolism, her pain into policy, while the world saw a loyal queen behind the scenes. She may have been pulling strings, that's so. Was Arsinoe a pawn? Absolutely. In the beginning, but by the end. She may have been the quietest, most dangerous player the Ptolemaic court had ever seen. And in a world that tried to silence her, she wrote her power into the stones of history. Imagine this, a woman who endured incest, forced marriage, and the suffocating expectations of a royal court, becomes not just queen, but a goddess. Arsinoe too didn't just rule alongside her brother. She didn't just advise, lead, or survive. She was deified. After her death, Ptolemy II declared her a goddess, a living divinity whose spirit would continue to protect Egypt. At first glance, this sounds like royal flattery, another political move to elevate the monarchy, right? But look deeper, and you'll find something else. Temples were built in her honor, festivals were held in her name, coins were minted with her image, and the title, the Sister Queen Goddess. She became known as Arsinoe I Philadelphus, Arsinoe with a sibling lover, not as a scandal, but as a symbol of harmony, fertility, and divine balance. In a way, this was the final transformation of Arsinoe's pain. She was once a victim of her father's lust, of political manipulation. Then she became a ruler, calculated, strategic, powerful. And finally, she became myth. The people didn't just remember her. They worshipped her in her name. Women prayed for safe childbirth. Soldiers marched under her blessing. Families gave offerings asking for her protection. What does it mean when the world turns its wounded into gods? Maybe it's a form of healing, turning suffering into something sacred. Maybe it's a lie, a beautiful story to cover an ugly truth. Or maybe, just maybe, it's both. Arsinoe II, once a princess in chains, became the very symbol of divine womanhood. But underneath the temples and coins and prayers lies a darker origin, a girl who was violated, used, and silenced. History made her a goddess. But we must remember the woman behind the marble, not just who she became, but what she endured to get there. The story of Arsinoe II ends not with fanfare, but with silence. No ancient biography survives. No scrolls reveal her thoughts. In the tomb that once held her body, lost, or maybe intentionally hidden. For a queen who was once deified, there is surprisingly little we truly know about her private life. The rituals, the ceremonies, the myths, they survived, but the truth of what she endured, that was buried, on purpose. Tone deepens. More inquisitive, why would such a powerful queen's real story vanish? The answer lies in royal control, in the weaponization of history. The Ptolemies were masters of image. They knew that the story told about Arsinoe had to be perfect. There could be no mention of incest, no whispers of abuse, no rumors of coercion. Instead, we see myth, divine union, sacred harmony, heavenly love between siblings. Euphemisms built to hide a crime and turn it into a miracle. In official records, she wasn't a woman who had suffered. She was a goddess, untouchable, untainted. And when you erase the pain, you erase the voice. There are whispers that her tomb was desecrated or relocated to protect the royal myth. Others believe it lies beneath modern-day Ephesus, misidentified and unacknowledged. Either way, her body, like her truth, lies hidden under centuries of dust. Silence became the shield of power, and Arsinoe, the girl who was sacrificed for the sake of empire, was turned into a symbol, and then forgotten as a person. So we must ask, is this how history works? That the voices of the wounded are carved out, so that the image of greatness can survive. Arsinoe's myth lived on for centuries. But the woman behind that myth, she was buried beneath golden lies. Until now, because we are remembering her, not as a goddess, not as a political tool, but as a woman, one who never got to speak for herself. 2,000 years have passed since Arsinoe II walked the marble halls of Alexandria. Since she was crowned, worshipped, silenced, and yet, her story still echoes. Because for all our progress, the world still struggles to listen to women who were used, who were abused, and then glorified for enduring it. The details may have changed, but the pattern remains. How many times in history and even today have women been told to stay silent, to wear their suffering like it's something noble, to call trauma by more acceptable names? How many women have been painted as powerful, when in truth, they were powerless behind closed doors? Arsinoe's story is not just ancient history, it is a mirror, a reflection of what happens when truth is buried for the sake of image. When we value myth over memory, propaganda over pain, gold over the girl beneath the crown. But here's the shift. Today, we get to choose what stories we tell. We get to look back and ask, who was erased, who was never allowed to speak, and maybe most importantly, who are we still silencing now? Arsinoe's pain was twisted into a fairy tale. But today, we take that fairy tale and break it open. We say her name. We tell her truth, not to shame the past, but to change the future. Because when we remember her not as a goddess, but as a girl who was used and caged, we give voice to millions more who've felt the same, that we remind the world that power without empathy is violence, that royalty without accountability is cruelty in gold, and that stories, even the ancient ones, still matter, still heal, still haunt, still teach. Arsinoe, too, may never get justice. But she will be remembered, not for the lies told in marble, but for the truth we finally dared to tell. Arsinoe too was not just a queen, she was a survivor in a palace of shadows, a woman crowned in gold. While caged by silence, her story is not some ancient scandal to gawk at. It's a message, a mirror, a warning. History often celebrates power, but it rarely asks what that power costs. Arsinoe's life was framed as a divine tale, a perfect union between God King and Goddess Queen. But behind that myth was a terrified girl, forced to obey, and then forced to smile. So why does this story matter? Because her pain wasn't a footnote, it was the foundation of her rule. Because every time we overlook the abuse beneath beauty, we build more golden prisons. Because when we don't tell the truth about the past, we let those same patterns repeat behind new doors, new titles, new smiles. This isn't just about Arsinoe, it's about every woman who was told to play a role, to pretend her trauma was destiny, to wear her pain like a crown. But we're not telling her story that way. Not anymore. Today, we say her name, not as a goddess, but as a human being. One who didn't get to choose her legacy, but who, at last, is getting her truth. If you've made it to this point, thank you. You've stepped beyond the marble statues and golden lies into the heart of something raw, real, and necessary. Share her story. Let it echo. Let it wake people up. NF. It moved you. Write truth over myth in the comments. Because history needs more than kings and temples. It needs voices like yours, brave enough to tell what was never meant to be told. Until next time, stay curious, stay awake, and never forget the woman behind the crown.